Today we're privileged to have Ms. Kendra Duckworth, a national speaker who specializes in the American with Disabilities Act, Title I and Rehabilitation Act compliance, interactive accommodation process, and the use of assistive technology as a job accommodation. She has also been credited with a number of nationally cited technical assistance documents. Ms. Duckworth comes to the Air Force with a great deal of experience from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where she served as the Disability Program Manager and as a lead consultant for the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy Job Accommodation Network. She assumed her position with the EO Office, Department of the United States Air Force, as the Disability Program Manager in July of this year, and is responsible for developing and administering Air Force-wide policy regarding disability and reasonable accommodation requirements for over 170,000 civilian employees. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Kendra Duckworth.
Thank you very much. This presentation was originally scheduled for October 30th, I believe, when the Hurricane Sandy hit. And I was watching the news that night, and I kept thinking, oh, I've got a presentation tomorrow, I've got a presentation tomorrow. I just want you to know I was ready. I had my waders out. I had a friend who was letting me borrow his truck. I was going to be here, but when they closed the base, I guess I decided we'll hold off. So I appreciate you guys rescheduling this for us, and for being here to talk about hiring wounded warriors and individuals with disabilities. Talk to my sidekick here. Thank you. This presentation is in response to October's National Disability Employment Awareness Month activities, and the theme for this year's Disability Employment Awareness Month was a strong workforce is an inclusive workforce. What can you do? What can you do to help Air Force meet its goals for employing individuals with disabilities, including wounded warriors? I'd like to start off with a little riddle. This is a newspaper article. It says, here's a riddle for you. What do you call a blind person who sits in a VP's office? Next slide, please. I don't know. What do you call a blind person who sits in a VP's office? You call them the vice president. Sometimes our attitudes are the biggest disabilities. And my goal as a disability program manager is to help change your attitudes and broaden your horizons to include individuals with disabilities in your workforce. Next slide. Thank you. Just an overview of what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of minutes. We're going to, very briefly, I'm going to give you a legal overview of our legal obligations to individuals with disabilities. And then I want to tell you about Air Force's goals for meeting our obligations to hiring individuals with disabilities. And the best way we can do that is to use the Schedule A hiring authority. So if you're not familiar with Schedule A, you'll have all the information you need to go out and hire individuals with disabilities. What I've learned as a disability program manager is when you hire more people with disabilities, you have to provide more reasonable accommodations. So we'll talk about our reasonable accommodation procedures and policies and how I can assist you in providing reasonable accommodations. I'm going to leave you with some resources and partnerships to help you with making those reasonable accommodations, and we're also going to talk about special programs for hiring wounded warriors. So with that in mind, we'll get started. My goal is to make sure that Air Force is a model employer. As a supervisor, you should strive to meet the agency's goals for hiring, placing, and advancing individuals with disabilities. You should be supporting an active recruitment program which includes individuals with disabilities, and understand your obligations under the Rehabilitation Act when making hiring decisions and reasonable accommodations. Something we don't talk about that often is that disability is part of your diversity program. Individuals with disabilities are the most diverse group of individuals you will ever find, because disability doesn't stick to one type of race, religion, or gender. Disability can cover the gamut of all of those. So including disability as part of your diversity program makes your program that much more diverse and will make it more successful. Sorry, I'm not used to looking behind me to see what's going on. So let's talk about the Rehabilitation Act. Why do we have to do this? And I'm getting to that point in my life where I have to wear glasses to read my slides now. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability by the federal government, federal contractors, and recipients of federal financial assistance. Not only does it prohibit discrimination, it requires us to do very proactive things. It protects individuals with disability, first of all, from discrimination. But it requires employers to provide reasonable accommodation to qualified applicants and employees with disabilities when those accommodations are necessary. It also requires federal agencies to establish affirmative action programs for the hiring and the advancement and the retention of individuals with disabilities. It prohibits employers from making improper disability-related inquiries or requiring improper medical examinations of individuals with disabilities. It requires us all to keep employers to keep medical documentation confidential. It requires employers to comply with anti-harassment standards, and it prohibits retaliation of employees and employers. Let me just talk to you a minute about the medical questions, medical questionnaires. When I graduated college back in the early 90s, my first job out of school was working as a vocational counselor for the state of West Virginia. And my job was to get unemployed, disabled coal miners jobs within the community. And it's a very difficult process to try to find a job for a person with a 5th grade education who has a back injury, is now not able to do heavy labor or work in the coal mines. So it was a challenge, not any, to say the least, it was a challenge. Back in the 90s especially, if you looked at an employment application, the first page was usually that standard information about you, who you are, how do we contact you, your work history. If you looked on the back of an employment application, what did you usually see? A list of medical questions. Have you ever been treated for any of these conditions? And it would list everything from back injuries to psychiatric disabilities. It would also ask whether or not you'd ever been injured on the job or filed a workers' compensation complaint. Those were legal questions back in the late 80s, early 90s, and probably even before that. As an individual with a disability, I know, and as an employer, you probably know, what happens to a person who says yes to any of those questions? Where does that application go? It goes in the trash, doesn't it? Because at that time, our discrimination against individuals with disability wasn't all that subtle, and it wasn't illegal to do that. That's why it's really important under the Rehabilitation Act and under the Americans with Disabilities Act not to ask medical questions. Now it's illegal to do that, to make medical inquiries during the application phase. So if you have an individual who comes to work for you and you have questions about whether or not they have a disability, you cannot ask them those questions unless you're prepared to ask every applicant those questions. And only in situations where that question is relevant to the job. It has to be what's called job-related and consistent with business necessity. So if this job requires me to carry 100-pound bags of potatoes, then you could ask me, this job requires that you be able to carry 100 pounds of potatoes. Can you do that? It's a yes or no question. You can't ask questions related to any obvious physical disability that I may have or any treatment for those conditions. What this does is that it evens the playing field for individuals with disabilities. I have been in job interviews where I spent most of the interview talking about my medical condition and very little of the time talking about my skills and abilities. When you're in that situation, I know that if you're more interested in my medical condition and less interested in what I can do for you or what skills I bring to the job, I know that I'm not going to get that job. So it levels the playing field so that everybody gets asked the same questions and we focus on the person's skills and abilities, not their disabilities.